The first whispers began long before she entered the room. They crept along the silk-lined walls, slipped beneath crystal chandeliers, and settled like dust upon every waiting ear. In the winter of that year, when London society gathered beneath candlelight to judge one another's worth, her name was spoken not with admiration but with a careful, almost pious regret. She arrived as one already measured and found wanting, her presence a reminder that fortune was as fickle as fashion, and far more cruel. She stood at the threshold of the ballroom, gloved hands folded, spine straight with practiced composure. Her gown was modest yet elegant, chosen not to dazzle but to survive scrutiny. Ivory silk fell cleanly along her figure, unmarred by excess ornament, as though she feared drawing attention to herself. Once, such restraint would have been praised. Tonight, it marked her as a woman who could no longer afford extravagance. The world had taught her that beauty invited envy, but humility invited survival. They watched her as she moved forward, every step deliberate, each breath measured. She felt the weight of their gazes more sharply than the chill outside, though no one spoke to her directly. It was always like this now. Smiles that never reached the eyes, greetings softened by pity, invitations extended out of obligation rather than desire. She was no longer dangerous, nor desirable. She was merely unfortunate. Not long ago, her name had been paired with promise. Her family's decline had been whispered about even then, but gently, as one might discuss an approaching storm while the sun still shone. When her father died, leaving debts that swallowed the estate whole, sympathy arrived swiftly, then departed just as fast. Respect, she learned, was a luxury afforded only to those who could maintain appearances. Without fortune, a woman's dignity became negotiable. It was said she had refused advantageous offers out of foolish pride. Others claimed she had waited too long, believing affection might one day arrive. The truth mattered little. Society preferred its own version of events, one where her fall could be explained and therefore dismissed. Tonight, she felt every imagined failure stitched into her reputation like a second skin. Across the room, he stood untouched by such judgments. The Duke was impossible to ignore, even when he wished to be. Tall, immaculately composed, he observed the gathering with the cool detachment of a man accustomed to command. His dark attire set him apart from the brighter hues around him, as though he had stepped out of shadow rather than candlelight. Conversations faltered subtly in his vicinity, voices lowering in instinctive deference. He was known not for cruelty, but for an absence of softness that made others uneasy. His presence alone carried authority, and his gaze, when it moved, seemed to weigh and measure without mercy. He had inherited not only a title but a reputation for restraint so severe it bordered on legend. No scandal clung to him, no warmth either. He was admired, feared, and utterly alone by choice. Many speculated he would never marry, for marriage required compromise, and compromise was not a language he appeared to speak. Yet tonight, fate had drawn them into the same cruel orbit. She did not look at him at first. It was enough to feel the shift in the room, the subtle realignment of attention as eyes flickered between them. Whispers sharpened, curiosity ignited. What business had she near a man so far beyond her reach? She sensed the unspoken question lingering in the air, heavy with anticipation and quiet malice. When their eyes finally met, there was no spark, no sudden recognition. Only a brief, assessing pause, as impersonal as a transaction. His gaze did not linger, yet it left her unsettled. In that moment, she understood something with startling clarity. This was not a man who would rescue her, nor one who would ruin her out of passion. If he entered her life, it would be with intention, not impulse. The proposal came days later, delivered not with romance but precision. There were terms, expectations, boundaries drawn with the same careful logic one might apply to a treaty. Marriage, he explained, would serve them both. Her name would be shielded, her future secured. In return, he would gain what society valued most: order, silence, and control over the narrative. Love was neither offered nor implied. It was unnecessary, perhaps even inconvenient. She listened without interruption, hands folded just as they had been in the ballroom. The humiliation of accepting such an arrangement burned quietly within her, yet desperation spoke louder than pride. She had reached the edge of her options, where dignity could no longer pay debts nor protect her from scandal's teeth. Survival, she realized, was its own form of courage. The wedding was discreet, almost austere. There were no cheers, no sighs of envy. Only the solemn murmur of vows spoken without illusion. That night, as she waited beneath heavy drapes for a gesture that never came, she learned the true cost of her decision. He did not kiss her. He did not touch her. His words, when he finally spoke, were calm and devastating in their honesty. "I feel no love, no desire for you," he said quietly, as though stating a fact rather than a wound. She nodded, accepting the truth as she had accepted everything else. Yet as he turned away, leaving her alone with flickering firelight and the echo of his restraint, a single thought took root within her weary heart. If this marriage was built on survival alone, she wondered how long it would endure once pride was called to stand before judgment. Morning arrived in the Duke's house without warmth. Light filtered through tall windows, pale and restrained, touching polished floors and heavy drapery but offering no comfort. She learned quickly that the estate itself reflected its master, imposing, orderly, and emotionally distant. Servants moved with quiet efficiency, addressing her with perfect courtesy yet watching her closely, as though uncertain how long her presence would last. She was mistress in name, but authority, like affection, remained withheld. Days passed in composed silence. Meals were taken at opposite ends of an elongated table, conversation limited to necessity. He never raised his voice, never displayed impatience. His restraint was absolute, and in its perfection lay its cruelty. She found that indifference wounded more deeply than anger. Still, she conducted herself with dignity, refusing to betray the ache that followed her through echoing corridors and unlit rooms. Yet the smallest changes began almost imperceptibly. One afternoon, caught in sudden rain as she returned from a charitable visit, she was met at the door with a cloak already warmed by the fire. No words accompanied the gesture. The Duke did not look at her as it was placed upon her shoulders, yet she felt the intention behind it, quiet and deliberate. She thanked him softly. He inclined his head and walked away, leaving the moment unresolved. At dinner the following evening, her chair was drawn back before she reached it. The servant hesitated, unsure, until the Duke nodded once. The acknowledgment was subtle, easily missed by any but her. She felt a strange tightening in her chest, not of joy, but of confusion. These gestures offered no promise, yet they unsettled the careful boundaries she had learned to accept. Society, however, noticed everything. Their first appearance together drew more attention than her wedding ever had. She stood beside him beneath chandeliers brighter than memory, her hand resting lightly upon his arm as propriety demanded. Whispers followed them like shadows. Some marveled at her audacity, others at his inscrutability. Why had such a man chosen such a wife? The question lingered unspoken, sharpening with each passing glance. She endured the scrutiny with practiced calm, though each whispered judgment felt like a blade pressed gently against her composure. The Duke remained impenetrable, greeting acquaintances with cool courtesy. He offered her no public reassurance, no visible protection. If anything, his detachment seemed to confirm society's worst suspicions, that she was merely a convenience, easily replaced. The scandal came quietly, as such things often did. During an afternoon gathering, amid porcelain cups and measured laughter, a lady of considerable rank allowed her smile to sharpen. The remark was delivered sweetly, almost kindly, yet its intent was unmistakable. She was reminded of her origins, her debts, her fortune salvaged by marriage rather than merit. The room stilled, breath held in collective anticipation. She answered with grace, her voice steady despite the heat rising behind her eyes. She spoke of gratitude, of duty, of the privilege of serving her household. Polite phrases, carefully chosen, that revealed nothing of the humiliation curling within her. All the while, she was acutely aware of the Duke's silence beside her. He neither intervened nor rebuked. His stillness cut deeper than the insult itself. When they departed, the carriage ride passed without comment. The city blurred beyond the windows, wet with dusk and unspoken truths. She stared ahead, hands folded tightly in her lap, unwilling to reveal the tremor threatening her resolve. He sat opposite, posture unchanged, gaze distant. The silence stretched until it pressed upon her chest, heavy and inescapable. That night, sleep eluded her. The house creaked softly, settling into darkness, while she lay awake replaying every word, every glance. Shame was a familiar companion now, yet something new stirred beneath it, a quiet resentment, carefully contained. She had accepted the terms of survival, but she had not surrendered her worth. If this marriage required silence, she would offer it, but she would not beg for dignity. Days later, a small box appeared upon her dressing table. It bore no note, no explanation. Inside lay a simple object, unadorned yet unmistakably personal. It was not jewelry meant to impress, but something chosen with consideration, even restraint. She recognized it at once, and the realization unsettled her more than any grand display might have. This was not obligation. It was awareness. She carried the weight of that knowledge with her as rumors continued to circulate. The scandal grew, embellished by those who delighted in speculation. It reached the Duke's ears one evening as he paused outside a closed door, listening to a conversation never meant for him. The words struck with careless precision, questioning his judgment, mocking his choice. For the first time, his composure faltered. Inside, she stood alone, unaware of the moment forming beyond the threshold. She gazed at her reflection, seeing not disgrace but endurance. Yet as footsteps sounded behind her, measured and deliberate, she sensed a shift in the air. He had heard the whispers, and something within him had stirred. Whether pride or conscience, she could not know, but she felt, with sudden certainty, that silence would no longer suffice. Night settled heavily upon the house, pressing against the windows as though seeking entry. Firelight flickered low in the drawing-room, casting uncertain shadows that softened the sharp lines of furniture and walls alike. She stood near the hearth, hands clasped before her, listening to the quiet pulse of her own breath. The day's composure had abandoned her, leaving behind a fragile stillness she could no longer pretend was strength alone. He entered without announcement, the door closing behind him with deliberate care. The sound seemed to echo, marking the moment as something separate from all that had come before. He did not approach her at once. Instead, he remained near the threshold, observing her as one might observe a landscape altered by storm, recognizable, yet irrevocably changed. His presence filled the room, not with menace, but with restraint so taut it threatened to fracture. She turned slowly, meeting his gaze with an honesty she no longer wished to conceal. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken histories and carefully avoided truths. At last, she spoke, her voice quiet but unwavering. She told him she was tired of whispers, tired of standing beside him as though invisible, tired of gratitude mistaken for submission. Each word emerged without accusation, yet each carried weight. She confessed what she had never intended to say aloud. That she had married him not for comfort nor ambition, but because the world had left her no gentler choice. That survival had demanded sacrifice, and she had offered herself willingly, believing dignity could endure even without affection. Her shame, she admitted, lay not in the marriage itself, but in the knowledge that she was unloved within it. He listened without interruption, hands folded behind his back, expression unreadable. Yet something shifted as her words settled into the silence. The fire cracked softly, a brief rebellion against the stillness. She continued, speaking of the insult she endured publicly, of his silence beside her, and how it wounded more deeply than open disdain. She did not ask for defense, only acknowledgment. She did not beg for love, only truth. When she finished, her composure faltered. She turned away, unwilling to let him witness the tremor that betrayed her restraint. For a moment, she feared he would retreat once more into silence, leaving her confession unanswered. Instead, she heard his measured steps draw closer, felt the weight of his attention settle upon her like an unseen hand. He spoke at last, his voice low, carrying none of its usual detachment. He told her he had not expected her strength, nor the quiet resolve with which she endured judgment. He admitted that her presence had unsettled him, not because she demanded anything, but because she asked for nothing. He had believed restraint to be protection, pride to be armor. He was only now realizing how isolating that armor had become. He confessed that he had entered the marriage believing himself untouched by consequence, certain he could maintain distance without cost. He had been wrong. Each whisper against her name had echoed uncomfortably within him. Each slight she bore without complaint had exposed the hollowness of his indifference. He did not claim love, nor did he soften his words with false sentiment. He offered only honesty, stripped of ceremony. She turned back to him then, searching his face for reassurance she knew better than to expect. What she found instead was uncertainty, unfamiliar and raw. The sight unsettled her, awakening something both hopeful and terrifying. For the first time, she saw not a duke, but a man confronting the limits of his own control. They stood close now, the space between them charged with unspoken possibility. He told her he could not promise affection where it did not yet exist, but he could no longer deny the change she had wrought within him. He acknowledged her dignity, her courage, and the injustice of her solitude. His words did not erase the past, but they reshaped its meaning. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping softly against the glass, as though punctuating the moment with quiet insistence. The world beyond the room faded, leaving only the fragile truth they now shared. She felt lighter, not because her circumstances had changed, but because she had been seen at last. Yet as the fire burned lower and silence returned, a question lingered between them, unresolved and insistent. If truth had been spoken in private, what would it demand when tested by the eyes of society? As he stepped back, restoring distance with careful restraint, she sensed that the confessions exchanged that night had set something irrevocable in motion, and neither pride nor silence would be enough to stop what must now come. The summons arrived without ornament, a sealed notice delivered with the same quiet authority that governed the Duke's household. By morning, the rumor had already taken shape, traveling faster than truth ever could. Her name was bound to accusation, spoken in drawing rooms and corridors with renewed appetite. It was said she had overstepped, had forgotten her place, had manipulated a marriage beyond its intent. She read the words once, then folded the paper with steady hands, aware that survival had carried her to this moment, but judgment would decide what remained. The hall was vast and unyielding, its marble floor cold beneath measured footsteps. She stood alone as eyes followed her progress, each glance a verdict already formed. The air smelled faintly of polished stone and damp wool, heavy with expectation. Men of rank whispered behind gloved hands, women observed with sharpened curiosity. At the far end, raised and austere, sat those empowered to weigh reputations as though they were coins. She lifted her chin, refusing to bow beneath the invisible weight pressing upon her shoulders. He had not yet arrived. That absence spoke loudly, feeding the narrative already unfolding. She felt the familiar sting of isolation, sharper now for having once glimpsed its opposite. The accusations were delivered with careful phrasing, their cruelty masked by propriety. She was accused of ambition disguised as humility, of leveraging pity into position. Each charge landed softly, yet its cumulative force threatened to erode the composure she had fought so hard to maintain. She answered only when required, her voice calm, her words precise, dignity her final defense. When the doors opened at last, the sound carried through the chamber like a held breath released. He entered without haste, his presence altering the room's balance instantly. Conversations faltered, attention realigned. He did not look at her at first. His gaze moved instead to those assembled, measuring them with the same restraint he applied to all things. The Duke removed his gloves slowly, deliberately, as though each motion were a declaration of intent rather than habit. He was expected to remain detached. Custom allowed it, pride demanded it. To protect his name, he needed only silence. She felt the moment narrowing, the future poised upon a single choice not her own. When he finally turned toward her, his expression held no anger, no indulgence. It held resolve. He stepped forward, breaking the prescribed distance, and addressed the chamber with a voice that carried without effort. He spoke not of rumor, but of truth. He stated the nature of their marriage plainly, without apology or embellishment. He acknowledged its beginnings in necessity, yet rejected the interpretation that necessity diminished honor. He named her character, her restraint, her endurance in the face of cruelty. Each word was chosen carefully, yet the effect was unmistakable. The room shifted, unease rippling through those who had expected compliance instead of conviction. He declared that if blame was to be assigned, it rested with him alone. That he had asked for silence, distance, and order, and she had given him all three without complaint. He spoke of pride not as a virtue, but as a failing he had mistaken for strength. His voice did not waver as he claimed her publicly, irrevocably, as his wife in more than name. The declaration landed like thunder restrained by civility. She stood motionless, heart pounding, as the meaning of his words settled over her. It was not love he proclaimed, but allegiance, chosen and visible. The court murmured, its authority momentarily disrupted. Judgment hesitated, uncertain how to proceed when power refused its expected shape. The accusations lost their edge, unraveling beneath the weight of his ownership of the narrative. When the proceedings ended, it was without triumph. There were no apologies offered, no satisfaction granted. She was dismissed with formality, yet something fundamental had shifted. As they walked side by side from the hall, she felt the strange disorientation of being seen without having asked. Outside, the sky hung low and gray, the city hushed beneath the aftermath of rain. The carriage ride passed in silence, not empty but full, as though words would only diminish what had occurred. She watched the streets blur past, aware that the world she re-entered would never be quite the same. His presence beside her felt different now, not colder, but steadier, as though something once withheld had been placed deliberately between them. That night, as she removed her gloves and set them carefully aside, she felt the weight of his choice settle into her bones. He had chosen her over pride before witnesses who would never forget it. Yet as she stood alone by the window, listening to the distant rhythm of the city, she wondered whether a declaration born of honor could one day demand something far more dangerous, the surrender of the heart. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet intensity, as though the world itself were holding its breath. The house no longer felt entirely cold, yet neither had it warmed. Something delicate hovered between them now, unnamed and uncertain, shaped by what had been spoken publicly and what remained guarded in private. She moved through the rooms with renewed steadiness, aware that eyes beyond the walls watched her differently, measuring the change wrought by his choice. He did not retreat into distance as before, nor did he advance with sudden tenderness. Instead, he altered the smallest things, the ones that carried weight precisely because they were restrained. He waited for her before meals. He asked, not commanded. When their paths crossed, his gaze lingered just long enough to acknowledge her presence, not as obligation, but as intention. Each gesture spoke of care carefully learned, as though he feared mishandling something newly precious. Society adjusted, begrudgingly at first. Invitations returned, tentative and polite. Apologies were implied rather than offered, respect reassembled without acknowledgment of its earlier absence. She accepted it all with composed grace, knowing how fragile such favor could be. Yet she no longer felt compelled to prove her worth. Something steadier anchored her now, not reputation, but recognition. One evening, as twilight deepened the rooms into soft shadow, he asked her to walk with him through the winter garden. The air was sharp, scented faintly with frost and earth. Lamps cast gentle halos upon stone paths, illuminating her steps as she moved beside him. Neither spoke at first. Words had been used so carefully of late that silence felt almost reverent. At last, he stopped beneath a bare-limbed tree, its branches etched starkly against the darkening sky. He turned to her, removing his gloves with a deliberation she recognized. He told her that honor had compelled his public defense, but it was something quieter that now demanded his honesty. He had lived his life believing control was safety, that distance preserved power. She had undone that belief without force, merely by remaining. He confessed that he had begun to anticipate her presence, to listen for her footsteps, to consider her absence an intrusion rather than relief. These realizations unsettled him, yet he no longer wished to resist them. He did not speak of love as poets might. He spoke instead of choice, of willingness, of a future not yet defined but no longer empty. She listened, heart racing, aware of the risk in every word he offered. When she replied, her voice was steady, though emotion shimmered beneath it. She told him that she had learned to survive without expectation, that hope had once been a luxury she could not afford. His defense had given her more than protection, it had restored her agency. She would not accept affection born of duty alone. What she offered now was honesty, equal and unguarded. They stood facing one another, the world narrowed to breath and stillness. When he reached for her hand, the gesture was tentative, asking rather than claiming. She placed her hand in his, feeling the warmth of it, the quiet certainty of contact unburdened by obligation. In that moment, the marriage transformed, not through passion, but through mutual recognition. Time moved forward, as it always did. Seasons shifted, and with them, the rhythm of their lives. They learned one another gradually, respecting the scars left by solitude and pride. He spoke more freely, though still with care. She laughed more easily, the sound no longer restrained by fear. Love did not arrive as a storm, but as a steady tide, reshaping the shore through persistence rather than force. Years later, when their story was spoken of, it was often framed as a tale of redemption. Society admired the Duke's public stand, the courage of his declaration. Fewer understood the quieter triumph that followed, the daily choice to meet one another without armor. Yet it was there, in private moments, that their legacy truly formed. On an evening much like the first, she stood by the window, watching rain trace familiar paths upon the glass. He joined her, standing close enough that his presence felt natural, inevitable. He spoke her name softly, not as title, but as truth. She turned toward him, and this time, when he kissed her, there was no restraint, no distance, only the certainty of two lives bound not by survival, but by devotion freely chosen.